Atlanta, mid-1990s. Inside a genetics lab at Emory University, researchers are running mitochondrial and Y chromosome tests on 37 Seminole participants from Florida. They are looking for a genetic signature, a pattern buried in cell lines that no census taker or federal agent ever thought to check. What they find lands as two numbers, and the two numbers do not agree with each other. 95% of the maternal lines trace back to pure Native American ancestry. 11% of the male lines trace back to Europe. Sit with that contradiction for a moment, because it is the whole story in miniature. A nation whose legal identity has been decided by paperwork about blood for more than 100 years, and the blood itself refusing to confirm the paperwork's version of events. The year is 1997. The journal is the European Journal of Human Genetics. This is not folklore, not oral tradition dressed up as science. This is peer-reviewed data, cold and specific. Sitting in an academic record most people will never open. But the lab results are only the surface. Underneath them is a deeper archive of suppression, one built not out of DNA but out of documents, the Dawes Rolls, the blood quantum cards stamped with impossible fractions like 00, and a fight over Freedmen citizenship that is still active in tribal courts as recently as 2025. The real distortion was never hiding in a test tube, it was hiding in a filing cabinet. The lab numbers were only the beginning of what got buried. Carlia subscribe. Nahito is bar zarur kar dena. Is channel pe hum wahi cheezein kholte hain jo textbook skip kar jate hain. Say the word Seminole today, and most people picture a single nation, one bloodline stretching back centuries, unbroken and uniform. The federal record says otherwise. There are 3 federally recognized Seminole-descended groups in existence right now: the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida. Their populations are not small numbers hiding an obscure footnote. Oklahoma carries roughly 15,572 enrolled members. Florida's Seminole Tribe counts close to 4,000. And the Miccosukee tribe holds around 400. Pull back the enrollment figures, and the ethnic origins listed on record widen the picture further. Choctaw, Muskogee, Yamasee, Yuchi, Gullah. Layered inside those origins are named subgroups: Black Seminole, Miccosukee, Muskogos, each with its own historical weight. And beneath all of it sit 3 distinct languages that were spoken across these communities: Miccosukee, Muskogee, and Afro-Seminole Creole. 3 separate linguistic threads, coexisting under one tribal name. The expectation most outsiders carry is simple: one people, one bloodline, one shared origin point. The reality contained in these numbers is not that. Seminole was never a bloodline. It functioned, from its earliest use, as a political label, a term applied in the 1700s to people who had made a deliberate choice not to stay where they were told to stay. That label is where this actually starts. A century before there was a Seminole anything. To understand where the Seminole came from, the timeline has to move backward, past Florida, into the political structure of the Lower Creek world. Richard Sattler's 1996 ethnogenesis study traces the earliest proto-Seminole groups to the Coweta chiefdom, a Lower Creek polity that was already multi-ethnic under Coweta's rule. These groups did not arrive in Florida as a finished nation. They settled in the northern part of the territory in the early 1700s, while still nominally answering to Coweta authority, a loose thread not yet cut. The formal break did not come from a single dramatic split. It came during the American Revolution, when the Florida-based groups chose to side with the British, breaking with Creek neutrality and setting themselves apart politically from the Confederacy they had come from. Even that framing understates what actually happened. This was not one migration, one event, one clean departure. It was a slow leak of dissenters, drifting away from Central Creek towns over the course of decades, each wave adding to a settlement that had no unified leadership yet. One of the earliest breakaway leaders was Chief Cowkeeper, also known as Sakafi, and the group he led became a center of gravity for the new confederacy forming in Florida. The Muskogee language itself records what these people were becoming. The word Seminole, meaning separatist, or one who camps away from the regular towns, is the root of the name history would later settle on. What Spanish Florida offered these dissenters was not wealth or protection in any formal sense. It offered distance, geographic space away from Creek central authority, and enough autonomy to build something new. Distance was the draw. Refugees were the fuel. The Yamasee War, fought between 1715 and 1717, tore through Yamasee territory along the Savannah River, land that now sits inside present-day Georgia and South Carolina. The devastation was not abstract. It displaced entire communities, and in the early 18th century, survivors of that war moved south into Spanish Florida, carrying nothing with them but the fact of their survival. They were not alone in that migration. The Yuchi people joined the same southward movement, and their presence complicates the story further. The Yuchi did not even speak a Muskogean language, despite sharing cultural ground with the Muskogee. Before the Yamasee War scattered them, both the Yamasee and the Yuchi had belonged to the Muskogee Creek Confederacy. War, not shared ancestry, is what pushed them into the same stretch of Florida territory. This is the point where the assumed story of the Seminole collapses under its own timeline. At this stage, the people who would eventually carry the Seminole name were not one unified tribe fleeing a single enemy. They were refugees from multiple different wars, arriving from different directions, for different reasons, at different times. Even within this patchwork, distinctions held. The Apalachicola band settled separately along the Apalachicola River, forming its own group inside the larger mixture of arrivals. That separateness was not erased once a shared name was applied. By the Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823, the Apalachicola band was assigned its own reservations, distinct from the main body of Seminole lands. Formal, written proof that these groups remained politically separate even generations after the merger into one confederacy had supposedly taken place. Different wars, different homelands, one new name stitched over all of it. Long before any Creek refugees set foot in Florida, the land already had people living on it. The Calusa, the Appalachee, and the Timucua held this territory as its original indigenous populations, with histories that predate every migration this documentary has traced so far. By the time Creek migrants began moving into Florida, Spanish disease and colonial violence had already devastated these populations, thinning them to a fraction of what they had once been. The arrival of Lower Creek migrants did not stop that decline. It accelerated it. The migration effectively displaced the Calusa and the Miami, and Spanish authorities assisted in relocating the surviving remnants to Cuba, where disease finished the process colonization had started. What intermarriage did happen folded surviving Appalachee and Timucua individuals into the new Seminole communities forming around them, but this contribution was never the dominant thread. The genetic and cultural through-line that defined the emerging Seminole identity remained Creek. Archaeological and genetic evidence ties this same region back to the woodland and Mississippian mound-building cultures, a continuity stretching back over 1,000 years. That continuity has been almost entirely erased from popular memory once the label Seminole took hold of the historical narrative. The people displaced in this process left almost no descendants carrying a name of their own in the historical record. No tribal roles, no reservations, no federal recognition. Just absence, where a population used to be. One erasure enabled the next community to form on the same ground. Spain abolished slavery in Florida in 1693, decades before anything comparable existed anywhere in the English colonies. The decree was specific in its terms: freedom for any enslaved person who reached Florida and converted to Catholicism. This was not an act of pure conscience. Spain needed allies against British expansion, and later against the growing reach of the Americans. And a free black population loyal to the Spanish crown served that need directly. Word of the decree traveled fast, and it traveled in the direction Spain wanted. Enslaved people working the rice plantations of Carolina began fleeing south as early as 1689, years before the formal decree even existed, seeking out Spanish territory as a place where the plantation system's claims on their bodies simply stopped applying. Those who made it were not just handed freedom and left to fend for themselves. In exchange for their liberty, freedom seekers agreed to help defend St. Augustine militarily, and Spain followed through on its end by organizing these free black settlers into an actual militia unit. Not a symbolic gesture, an armed force. What this created, under a European colonial power operating in what is now the United States, was the first legal escape route for enslaved Africans on this continent. A full century before the Underground Railroad that most people learn about in school. Florida, under Spanish law, was functioning as organized sanctuary, while the 13 colonies were still generations away from any comparable system. That militia needed a home. In 1738, it got one. Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose was founded in 1738, roughly 2 miles north of St. Augustine, and it was built by more than 100 freedom seekers who had crossed into Spanish Florida under the terms of the earlier decree. Fort Mose, as it came to be known, stands as the first legally sanctioned free black town in the present-day United States. Not a hidden settlement, not an informal camp, but a recognized, fortified town with legal standing under Spanish authority. What formed inside Fort Mose was not a simple transplant of African culture onto Florida soil. Residents blended African, Native American, and Spanish elements together, producing something with no direct precedent. A genuinely new cultural configuration built out of three distinct traditions meeting in one place. The evidence for what happened at Fort Mose is not limited to old colonial documents. Between 1986 and 1988, Dr. Kathleen Deegan of the Florida Museum of Natural History led an archaeological investigation of the site, and that excavation produced physical evidence of the roles Fort Mose residents played in the ongoing conflict between Spanish and English colonial powers. Artifacts confirmed what the paper record had only implied. As Spanish control over Florida eventually shifted, the original Fort Mose community was transported to Cuba, and the town itself did not survive as a permanent settlement. But the model it had proven, armed, autonomous, free black settlements, operating under a degree of self-governance, did not disappear with it. That model kept reproducing itself, moving further into the Florida interior, finding new ground and new circumstances to take root in. The model outlived the town. It moved south, into the swamps, and found new allies waiting. As Creek migrants and runaway slaves both pushed deeper into Florida's interior, a distinct pattern took shape on the ground. Black maroon communities formed alongside Seminole villages, not folded inside them. Andrew Weich's 2002 University of Florida dissertation examined one of these towns in close detail, Pilaclicaha, and the picture that emerges from that research complicates any simple idea of what slavery meant in this context. These maroon communities operated with their own leaders and their own political systems, structures that existed separately from Seminole chiefs rather than under them. Residents of these towns were permitted to own weapons, an allowance that stands in direct contrast to the legal status usually attached to people classified as slaves of the Seminoles. They also controlled their own labor, deciding for themselves how their work was organized and used, a condition with no equivalent across the border under the American plantation system. When slave hunters or rival tribes came looking to claim these people, Seminole leaders often refused to hand them over, holding that line even when it brought outside pressure down on their own communities. The relationship, in practice, bore little resemblance to chattel slavery as it was practiced in the American South. The Indian allies who lived alongside these communities had their own term for them, Estelusti, meaning black people, a designation entirely separate from the language white Americans used to describe the same population. White Americans had their own word for these towns. It wasn't a compliment, and it started a war. A significant portion of the people who became Black Seminoles were Gullah fugitives, men and women who had escaped specifically from the rice plantations of South Carolina and Georgia. Gullah culture itself had formed on the Sea Islands as a fusion of traditions, carrying an unusually strong retention of West African linguistic patterns compared to other enslaved communities on the mainland. That Gullah linguistic base did not stay behind when its speakers moved into Florida. It carried directly into what is now called Afro-Seminole Creole, a language distinct enough in its structure and vocabulary to persist for centuries after its formation. Afro-Seminole Creole still appears today among the historical and cultural languages associated with the Seminole people, listed alongside Miccosukee and Muskogee as one of the three linguistic threads that make up Seminole heritage. This Creole did not stay confined to Florida either. It traveled with Black Seminole descendants as they moved into Texas, into Oklahoma, and even as far as Nacimiento, Coahuila in Mexico, a spread that maps out just how far this single linguistic branch reached over time. The persistence of Afro-Seminole Creole functions as its own kind of record, a cultural fingerprint tracing the same roots of movement that the 1997 mitochondrial DNA study sampled generations later. Language and biology, approached from two entirely separate disciplines, end up describing the same migration. That migration didn't stop moving once it reached Florida. It kept going for another century. By the early 1800s, the mixed Creek and Black communities established across Florida had become something American slaveholders across the border could no longer tolerate. Escaped slaves were finding permanent refuge there, protected by Seminole military strength. And every year that refuge held was a year the plantation economy's authority failed to reach across a national boundary. In 1818, General Andrew Jackson led United States troops into Spanish Florida, with a specific target: Native groups sheltering freedom seekers. This invasion is remembered in the historical record as the First Seminole War, and its consequences reached far beyond the immediate fighting. Spain, already stretched thin, proved unable to defend the territory, and that failure set the stage directly for the 1819 sale of Florida to the United States. Once Florida passed into American hands, the sanctuary system that had functioned under Spanish law for nearly a century lost its legal footing overnight. What had been a protected space, backed by treaty and colonial decree, became American soil governed by American slave law, with no transition period and no protection carried over. The stated target of Jackson's campaign was native land, but the underlying objective ran deeper than territory. What Jackson viewed as the real threat was the alliance itself, the working partnership between Native and Black communities that had held for nearly a century and showed no sign of breaking on its own. Losing that war didn't break the alliance, it hardened it. The Second Seminole War began in 1835 and did not end until 1842. 7 years of fighting that made it the longest and costliest Indian war in U.S. history up to that point. Among the commanders who distinguished themselves in that conflict was John Horse, a Black Seminole leader whose battlefield record marked him as one of the fiercest fighters on either side. The war's stated purpose was removal, forcing both Native Seminoles and their Black allies out of Florida and into Indian territory. But American military and political leaders carried a fear that went beyond simple relocation logistics. They worried specifically about what would happen if Black Seminoles were removed, together with their Native allies, concerned that the alliance itself might spread resistance further west once it reached new territory. Osceola stands as the most recognized Native resistance leader to emerge from this war. His role documented in detail in Patricia Wickman's 1991 book, Osceola's Legacy. Yet for all the attention his name draws, the war's actual outcome tells a more complicated story than a single hero narrative allows. Over more than 7 years of sustained combat, the United States never fully defeated the combined Seminole and Black Seminole forces in the field. What gets remembered as a Native American conflict looks different when read through the American government's own strategic concerns at the time. Those concerns treated this war as just as much an effort to prevent a permanent free Black community from surviving on U.S. soil as it was a campaign against Native resistance. Survival in the field didn't mean survival on paper. That fight was just getting started. Following the war's conclusion, most Seminoles, Native and Black alike, were forcibly relocated to Indian Territory during the 1840s. This removal placed them alongside the other members of what became known as the 5 civilized tribes: Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek, all pushed out of their southeastern homelands by the same federal policy. Among these 5 tribes, the Seminoles stood alone in one specific respect. They were the only one to formally enroll their former slaves as tribal members going forward. Every one of the 5 tribes technically carried freedmen populations within their communities, but only the Seminole wrote acceptance of those freedmen into ongoing tribal practice, rather than treating them as a separate class to be excluded. Indian Territory also produced relationships that had no precedent back in Florida. Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw communities, previously separated by distance and history, now found themselves living in close proximity to one another and to the Seminole, forming a new intertribal landscape none of them had experienced before. Not every Seminole made the journey to Indian Territory. A portion of the population moved south instead, joining the Miccosukee in the Everglades, resisting removal entirely and refusing to be part of the westward relocation altogether. That split, those who were removed to what became Oklahoma, and those who vanished into the Everglades rather than comply, created the geographic divide that still defines the 3 federally recognized Seminole groups in existence today. One nation split into 2 futures the moment removal began. In the 1850s, a group of Black Seminoles led by John Horse made a further exodus, moving beyond Indian Territory entirely and crossing into Mexico. There, they served as border troops for the Mexican government, trading their military service for land and, just as critically, for protection from re-enslavement. By the 1870s, many of these same families had made their way back north into Texas. Once there, the men began scouting for the U.S. Army, forming a unit that would come to be known as the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts. This unit never numbered more than 50 men at any given time, a small force by any military standard. Despite that small size, members of the unit earned 4 of the 16 Medals of Honor awarded to all Indian Scouts who served in the American West, a disproportionate share of the highest recognition available, from a group that barely registered in size against the larger military apparatus around them. Descendants of this specific branch are known today as the Mascogos, living in Nacimiento de los Negros, in the Mexican state of Coahuila. Their lineage traces a path through 5 distinct chapters of colonial and military history: Spain, Britain, the United States, the Confederacy of Tribes, and Mexico. without that identity ever dissolving into any one of those larger powers along the way. 4 medals of honor from 50 men. That number alone should have guaranteed recognition. It didn't. The Act of April 26, 1906, authorized what became known as the final Seminole Dawes Rolls, the federal document Congress used to formally decide, once and for all, who counted as a Seminole citizen in the eyes of the United States government. These rolls split people into separate categories, by blood citizens on one side, freedmen citizens on the other, even in cases where families were genetically and historically intertwined across that exact dividing line. The categorization carried no scientific basis whatsoever. There was no DNA science available in 1906. The rolls were compiled instead through visual classification and community testimony, judgments made by federal agents looking at people and listening to neighbors, not by any biological measurement. This is the precise bureaucratic moment where blood stopped being a biological fact and became a legal category for the Seminole Nation, a distinction written into federal policy rather than discovered in any laboratory. The Seminole Nation's own modern legal testimony acknowledges this directly, stating that the concept of Indian blood was historically used to deny citizenship to Native Americans themselves, not simply to exclude freedmen from the rolls. Many tribes, including the Seminole Nation, have since formally abandoned blood quantum and KDIB standards in favor of ancestry-based enrollment, at least on paper. In practice, the freedmen category created back in 1906 still shapes who receives full citizenship rights more than a century later. A paperwork category from 1906 is still deciding who counts as family in 2026. Return now to the Huoponen, Toroni, and Wallace study. 37 Seminole participants, sampled from Florida, the same numbers this documentary opened with. Look closer at what the maternal line data actually contained. 95% of tested mtDNA fell into the 4 established Native American haplogroups, A, B, C, and D. No European mtDNA turned up anywhere in the sample, meaning that wherever European ancestry entered this population, it did not enter primarily through maternal lines. The remaining portion of the maternal data tells its own story. About 5% of mtDNA belong to haplogroup L1, a marker specific to African maternal lineages, direct genetic confirmation of the same African ancestral thread this documentary has traced through Fort Mose, through the Maroon Towns, through the Gullah migration. The Y chromosome data, drawn from 26 male participants, produced an entirely different pattern. 11% of Y chromosomes carried haplotypes generally attributed to European ancestry. Critically, none of the Y chromosomes carried standard African haplotypes at all, meaning the African contribution so clearly visible in the maternal line essentially disappears the moment you narrow the focus to the paternal line alone. The study's own authors connected this asymmetry to historical accounts of the tribe integrating both European and African ancestry, but at markedly different rates depending on which line of descent you trace. The genetic record and the historical record, read together, describe the same population from 2 different directions and arrive at the same uneven answer. Different rates by sex isn't a footnote. It's the whole story, if you know how to read it. A population where maternal African ancestry shows up clearly but paternal African ancestry does not, is not a random statistical quirk. It points toward a specific historical pattern. The descendants of African women stayed inside the community across generations, while European men who fathered children were more likely to be recorded, remembered, or simply present in far larger numbers than European women ever were. This lines up precisely with the well-documented historical record of European traders, soldiers, and settlers marrying or fathering children with Native and Black Seminole women, while European women almost never joined these communities themselves. The genetic record and the historical record are describing the same social pattern from 2 different vantage points. It is worth being honest about the size of that genetic record. 37 mtDNA participants, 26 Y chromosome participants. That is a small sample, and it remains, to this day, the primary published genetic dataset specifically on the Seminole population. No large modern autosomal study of the tribe has ever filled that gap. This limitation matters. A small sample can suggest a pattern clearly enough without proving exact modern percentages for the population as a whole. Even accounting for that limitation, a small and honest dataset like this one directly contradicts any pure-blood, single-origin tribe narrative. The exact narrative blood quantum paperwork was built to enforce. The paperwork asked a binary question: Indian or not? The biology answered with a mixture that refuses to sit inside binary boxes at all. That mismatch is exactly why the Freedmen citizenship fight has never been a simple genetics question. It is a legal dispute layered on top of biology that was never clean to begin with. The biology stayed messy, the paperwork demanded clean answers anyway. Today, the Seminole Nation grants freedmen only limited citizenship, voting rights, committee seats, and office, confined to 2 designated freedmen bands rather than full standing within the tribe as a whole. This limitation followed the Seminole Nation v. Norton decision, a case the tribe lost in court, and yet full citizenship for freedmen was still withheld afterward regardless of the ruling. The physical evidence of this limitation is printed and mailed out to real people. Freedmen membership cards were reissued explicitly reading Freedmen on the front, 00 blood quantum beneath it, and voting privileges only on the back. A bureaucratic document stating, in plain language, exactly how far that citizenship extends and no further. Genealogist and advocate Marilyn Vann has been a central figure fighting this exact classification for decades, working across both Cherokee and Seminole cases simultaneously. Attorney John Veely represented freedmen in these fights for 25 years, working across multiple of the 5 tribes over that span, building legal arguments that would eventually produce results in at least one of them. In 2017, Judge Thomas F. Hogan ruled in Cherokee Nation v. Nash and Vann that freedmen citizenship rights were coextensive with those of native Cherokees, a decision that placed both groups on identical legal footing within that tribe. The Seminole Nation has not mirrored that precedent for its own freedmen population, and the gap between the Cherokee ruling and the Seminole Nation's continued limited citizenship policy remains active, unresolved law as of 2026. One tribe closed that gap, the other one hasn't, and the 1906 rolls are still the reason why. Commercial DNA tests can indicate the presence of Native American genetic markers somewhere in a person's ancestry. What they cannot do, under any circumstance, is prove descent from one specific tribe, including the Seminole Nation. That distinction is not a technicality. It is the entire legal foundation the tribe stands on. Tribal citizenship, according to the Seminole Nation's own legal position and confirmed by Supreme Court precedent in Morton v. Mancari, is a political classification, not a racial or genetic one. This means a person could carry a strong genetic signature of Native ancestry and still hold zero legal claim to Seminole citizenship without documented lineage tracing back to the Dawes Rolls specifically. The reverse is equally true and arguably more revealing. Someone with a Seminole freedman ancestor listed on the Dawes Rolls but with Native ancestry running through a separate, undocumented line could carry genuine biological Native heritage that the current system does not recognize in any form. A male freedman descendant could theoretically be a quarter Native by blood through his paternal grandfather and still be classified purely as freedman because the matrilineal system used to determine status ran through the mother's line alone. This is the exact bind the Estelusti, the Black Seminole freedmen studied in Jennifer Wagner's research, have negotiated for generations. Genetically plausible, legally excluded. Plausible by biology, excluded by paperwork. That gap is the whole controversy in one sentence. Travel to Nacimiento de los Negros in Coahuila, Mexico, where Muskogee descendants of John Horse's exodus still live today, carrying that history forward in a country most people never associate with Seminole ancestry at all. Travel to Bracketville, Texas, home to the descendants of the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts, where community cemeteries still list Medal of Honor recipients among their dead, buried testimony to a military record most textbooks skip entirely. Travel to the Bahamas, where a separate branch of Black Seminole descendants is known locally as Black Indians, a name carrying its own distinct history on a different island chain altogether. Travel to Oklahoma, where Seminole freedmen bands continue their citizenship fight inside the Seminole Nation's own government structure, an active dispute rather than a settled chapter of history. Travel to Florida, where the Seminole tribe and the Miccosukee tribe both maintain federally recognized status without the same freedmen dispute, having taken a different historical path after the original removal split the population apart. Every one of these communities, scattered across 5 countries and multiple state lines, traces back to the same 18th century Florida ethnogenesis this documentary has followed from the beginning. The same Creek, Yamasee, Yuchi, and Fort Mose threads, braided together into one people and then scattered again by war, removal, and exile. No single genetic test accounts for this population. No single tribal roll accounts for it. No single national border currently holds the whole of what this history actually produced. 5 countries, 1 shared ancestry, 0 unified record of it. Return, one final time, to the numbers this documentary opened with. 95% Native maternal ancestry, 11% European paternal ancestry, and an African maternal thread that the paternal record erases entirely. That data is nearly 30 years old now, drawn from just 37 people, and it still remains the most detailed published genetic snapshot of a nation, shaped by 3 continents worth of refugees. The Dawes Rolls that decided citizenship in 1906 are still, in 2026, the document determining who receives full rights inside the Seminole Nation. Marilyn Vann and John Velli's decades of legal work prove this is not settled history sitting quietly in an archive. It is an active fight, happening in the same years this video is being made. The Muskogos in Mexico, the Scouts' descendants in Texas, and the Freedmen bands in Oklahoma are all, genetically and historically, part of the same population that the 1906 rolls tried to split apart on paper. No updated large-scale genetic study of the Seminole Nation has been published since that 1997 sample of 37 people. The fullest scientific picture of this population remains incomplete, whether by design or by neglect. What would a modern, full population study actually reveal about a nation still governed by a 120-year-old paper definition of blood?